Where I live, a lot of the young people come over just to see the animals, see what kind of creatures Bob's got that day. And I think we need to learn to respect nature and all of God's little creatures. Yeah, because isn't he cute? Well, that's a close-up and a half there, isn't it? Little devil. You ready? Let's do it.
In the classic 6th century BCE Chinese philosophical text, the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu describes the Tao, translated often as the way of being in the world, as a spiritual force that animates all things. Lao Tzu describes the experience of nature for a person who is in touch with that spirit. In harmony with the Tao, the sky is clear and spacious. The earth is solid and full. All creatures flourish together, content with the way they are, endlessly repeating themselves, endlessly renewed. Once again, returning to this book by Congdon Blandy and Kuiman, Happy Clouds, Happy Trees, The Bob Ross Phenomenon. This book is riddled with examples and comparisons and relations of Bob to cultural figures and cultural movements in art, in society, in history, in spiritual engagements, whether it's philosophy or religion. It was in this book, and we're primarily going to be looking at this book, and we're going to be unpacking much of what this book has to say about Bob and how he fits into history. And we're going to find that there's so much more to Bob than just being a painter, even a teacher, and especially even a TV show host. After finishing this book, I walked away with a deeper appreciation for what Bob was doing, but also a deeper appreciation for all the movements and changes and shifts, evolutions and revolutions in history and society. And it's clear that what Bob was doing in The Joy of Painting, in each episode, he was sharing an experience with us. He was going beyond being an artist in the simple sense of just being a painter, and even a paint instructor. As we watch it, as he's talking directly into the camera, to us and only us, one person, not a crowd of people, Bob effortlessly converses, demonstrates, masterfully paints, effectively communicates what he's doing, but also where he's coming from.
We just want to show you as many ways as possible to create effects, and then you do it however you want. As I've mentioned over and over on this show, art is an expression of self. Express yourself. Enjoy it. Each and every one of us will see nature through different eyes. And that's what you are to paint, is what you see and the way you see it.
And especially after reading through this book and the many comparisons with other figures in history, and both past and present, and the movements within and throughout and currently happening in history itself, we can see that Bob was doing so much more than a gloss might tell us. He was cultivating an intimately sacred space in the joy of painting, like we talked about with just the simple name of joy.
The only rule that I adhere to in painting is that it should make you happy and you should enjoy it. If you comply with that rule, then how can you go wrong?
When you take a second and peel back the thin veneer as Bob the TV show host, we can see him intentionally playing around with the power that he recognizes not all people do, lying within the, at the time, medium of TV and movies, but now with everybody having a portable television station in their own pocket, the internet. You know, there is a, whether we realize it or not, a very almost magical power lying behind that glowing screen that we're always attached to. And it's especially evident in his commentary. He knows most of his viewers aren't lining his pockets in the business sense, going to his workshops or even buying his paint products and doing it at home. He knows most of us aren't even painting with him. The service, and it's explicit, he's been very clear about it, that he finds most rewarding is giving us all a genuine interaction with another human being.
This is paintings that have come from people all over the country who are just watching the show and they've picked up the brush and they've tried it. Aren't they fantastic? They really and truly are. And a lot of these people have never, absolutely never touched a brush before in their life. I'm like an old mother hen here. I get so proud when I see what people are doing.
And with Bob, it's always a consistently positive one. He cultivated that. We feel at ease and we feel relaxed because, at least partly, we know exactly what to expect from Bob. We can trust him to be the same genuine, authentic, nature-loving, individual appreciating man and painter, human being that he always was. And it was a half hour of joy that he was giving us. In part one, we got a little teaser, a taste. If you were one of the people who were able to make it past the first 10 minutes joke I was pulling on you, a couple people didn't get it. We got a taste for the layers that these authors were able to peel back from Bob Ross, and not just his paintings, but him, the man, and what he was doing by demonstrating his paintings to a mass audience, and demonstrating it in the style that he chose specifically to demonstrate it in. And part two was a look at his life and the common thread of his passion for not only painting, but the nature that he so often, the love of nature and the love of animals that he so often was able to incorporate into his shows and throughout his narratives and narrations on those shows. And then part three tonight is interpreting and analyzing, really putting Bob in the proper context of history, culture, society, and the movements that have defined all these things. And this book it is a lot of what I will be basing off tonight. We'll see. There's so much more, so many different angles, and so many different layers to Bob that I hope you guys will come away with a whole nother appreciation of not only Bob, and what he was doing, but great artists of all sorts and senses, not just painters, but great individuals, people who really made something of themselves and did something with their lives, and were able to communicate that and change the world for good. It's going to be another long, deep dive in our last, final, part 3 of our Bob Ross deep dive tonight. So I want you guys to settle in, get a snack, get comfortable, and join me as we break down what Bob was really doing with the joy of painting. And because we're going to be using this book so much tonight, I wanted to make a point to discriminate that this book has nothing to do with the company, Bob Ross Incorporated, that has been running and publishing books and his show, The Joy of Painting, and it was responsible for putting it on the internet and Twitch and YouTube. This book was written in 2011, before Bob made it to the internet in that wide, before all his videos were freely available the way they are now. And this book is actually peppered pretty thoroughly throughout with just mentions and examples and caveats, making a point to say that they are not the official Bob Ross owners of his image. And, you know, if you guys were able to watch the last part 2, the last half of that being a chronology of Bob's life, was a little bit tragic with the way his image has been used and manipulated and very closely guarded by the company. And so anyways, I just briefly wanted to just make a point that this isn't any propagandistic marketing gimmick by the company that owns Bob's name and likeness to promote him and make him look better. This was just a passion project by 3 authors, 2 of which are professors, and all of which are very knowledgeable and very immersed in the art world and outsider art, on the fringes of the art world, and the history of art and history more broadly speaking as well. So all that's to say that there's an intrinsic appreciation for Bob to be able to undertake to have the motivation to undertake such a project as writing an entire book. And the fact that this was not an official Bob Ross publication also means that they didn't want to infringe on the legal copyrights, the intellectual property, and including his name and likeness, which may be why they had to kind of write it the way they did, phrase it as the Bob Ross phenomenon rather than just his name. I don't know about that, but what I do know is that throughout the entire book I marked countless examples. I won't beat a dead horse here, but of the litigiousness of the company and the trepidation of the authors to write anything that might be critical of the company. And they outright just say that they don't want to be sued at a certain point, and they'll leave it to people more versed in legal copyright matters to make any judgments or criticisms of the company itself. So this is completely distinct. This is about Bob, the man, and the work he did that is now owned by Bob Ross Inc. But it is no reflection, judgment. Well, there's a little judgment there, as we'll shortly see. But it is no, it is not centered on the company or the people who currently run the company. Just to right off the bat, the cover, as we can see here, let's make sure I got the whole thing in. Yeah, the cover. So, for instance, well, the fro, Bob's most, recognizable quality, trait, physical appearance, is a manufactured fro. It hardly even looks real, but I'm almost positive that this is not an actual cutout of Bob, and if it is, it's only his fro, because they were very likely would have been sued if they used a picture of Bob, because the company owns, again, Bob's likeness. But further, the background, right on the cover page, the background, you would have thought that they would have at least got permission. They would have been granted permission by the company to use one of his paintings, but they didn't. They had to use a copy of another person painting in the Bob Ross style. On page 5, right in the beginning, they say, the purpose of this book is to address the Bob Ross phenomenon in an extended manner beyond the happy marketing of the books and the carefully controlled image of Bob Ross by Bob Ross Incorporated. Bob Ross he's come to mean more than what's communicated through the many publications of Bob Ross Inc. BR, like many celebrities, is a brand. It's they quote, copyrighted and trademarked. And they say it's difficult to reconcile for those who feel this personal relationship to Bob Ross. It's difficult to reconcile the restraints imposed on the expression of that personal relationship with the legal protections freely exercised by the corporation, with an economic and personal stake in Bob Ross, in the promulgation of his image. There's tons of examples like that throughout the book. So I won't get into any, unless we directly, stumble upon it. I won't go any further into it. I had a whole sheet document of just all the examples, which is really sad especially about someone like Bob, who the communication of his life and art and any other information that isn't exactly publicly available, it would do nothing but be an asset to the company and the world. So as they put, Bob Ross Inc., mind you, the owners of Bob Ross Inc., is very protective of all their intellectual property. Although we originally intended to reproduce paintings by Bob in this book, why wouldn't you, of course? It's a book about a painter. Several contacts offered images, even, of ones they owned. So consequently, the third author of this book, Danny Kuhlman, he's the one who painted the background image here. Done with that disclaimer right there. Now these, on the other hand, are from his book that I purchased, and these are, for me, the most beautiful pictures I found, and I thought it would be nice to look and have a nice backdrop. We have I think this one's called High Tide, and we see his signatures down here. Beautiful Florida idealized, as we'll touch upon in the future, idealized Florida beach with coconut palms reaching out over the waves, and only a slight hint of some rocks, and maybe not even then, because Florida is not known to be rocky, unlike Alaska. And we have a beautiful Alaskan landscape. This one, almost with the cloudiness and the massive soaring towering peaks, reminds me of some illustration that would go with a fantasy world like Lord of the Rings, with the cliff all the way up here and the ancient pathways and the old trees and the timeless looming just landscape and the peaks in the background, the grayness of it, the mistiness. So I thought you guys might like that. We're going to begin this journey through analyzing and interpreting Bob Ross and how history shaped him and how he in turn shaped history, and where and exactly how his shape fits in to all that. We're going to begin it with a quick gloss of how we should interpret Bob in some of the angles I'm going to be covering tonight. On page 69 in the book, Chapter 7, called Assessing Bob Ross's Paintings and His Approach to Art. They end the paragraph saying, how should we think about the Bob Ross phenomenon? And they use the word phenomenon because it's not him or his paintings or even his show. It's the constellation of all those. That's really where we find the depth of Bob. And he was beyond they pose questions. Was he a professional? Was he an amateur? His paintings were famously not very respected in the tight-knit, the elite art world. But they were absorbed and very much embraced by the masses, which in itself doesn't mean anything good or bad, because lots of good and bad art is embraced by both communities. And the status of his position as a painter, a teacher, a TV show host, of course, can discredit him in some circles as well. It can make his art seem bad. But one of the core ideas was not his art, but his relationship in we're going to see the parasocial relationship that he cultivated with the viewer. And not only in a one-sided, a one-directional way, which is I think that's the definition of parasocial in a lot of ways. That word is being used widely because Twitch in particular, but live streaming on YouTube and Twitch and elsewhere, is an interactive, a very participatory medium nowadays. And to the extent that people engage and feel that they know the personality, and then they can also, on the live stream in particular, communicate and be responded to the person they're watching, by the person they're watching, is it's not a direct two-way relationship, because the person on the person on the internet, we'll say, doesn't know nearly as much information about the person in the chat, for instance, than the other way around. But Bob Ross was an early example of someone who encouraged participation. And we'll see that, though, even though parasocial is a new concept, it's been around for over half a century. Scientists have been thinking about it and its effect on culture and psychology, the psyches of individuals who engage in it. What he was doing was clearly something deeper, as this book fleshes out. It was sharing joy, like we've talked about. It was communicating his own source of joy, where he found the most depth and meaning and purpose in life and in nature. In nature and creatures and rehabilitation and reaching people who previously hadn't been told that they had any, artistic bone in their body, couldn't draw a straight line, as he often said. He said that's baloney. We've talked about this. He wanted people to recognize the power that you get, and like Bill Alexander, his mentor, encouraged as well, through painting and expressing yourself, whether it's building something out of wood, carving stone, shaping metal, painting, writing a book, writing anything, or just nowadays talking on camera, expressing yourself. However you do it, you're bringing forth something creative in the act that you otherwise wouldn't have brought forth, or at least not nearly as been in touch with as quickly or maybe as deeply. And with painting in particular, you can understand something about yourself through what you're attracted to and what you choose to paint, what you like, what you dislike, and what you consume as well.
And with experience comes confidence. And with confidence, you know you can do anything that you believe you can do. From all of us here, until next time, I'd like to wish you happy painting. And God bless, my friend.
On page 68 here, Bob's focus is on the whole person, rather than any narrowly defined skill-based purpose, often associated with art education. Bob's greatest success as an educator is not that he taught an approach to painting, but he taught an approach to learning and living. He wanted to make it simple for people to discard and leap over the common obstacle of self-criticism that so many of us are crippled by. I'm going to use the arguments in this book to show you that Bob's true art was his style. And it was this quadruple, this compound creative act of being a painter, a teacher, a performer, a healer. He demonstrated, as an example, of the layers to his performance, for instance. Let's break that down. He demonstrated painting. He painted in front of the camera as a means of showing you how he painted. As he painted, in itself, that's a way of communicating and teaching, but he also walked you through it. He narrated it. He explained it. So as he was doing that, he was explaining why he did certain things. He used certain brushes, how he mixed colors on the palette, how he applied them, with what pressure, with what motivation for starting the order, arrangement in the order he applied the paint and the layers onto the canvas. Deeper still, he encouraged you and I to paint along with him. He wasn't just giving you instructions, saying, here's how I do it, continue watching. He said, no, why don't you get out your easel and canvas and paints and join me. Always, always encouraged us to join him. This is going to be a key to one of the areas of parasocial, the phenomenon that is accelerating in our culture today with streaming participation. And it's also might have been predated as well, and or at least overlaps widely with the art world and changes in movements that Congdon and company talk about in the book as well. Participatory versus consumptive, and also participatory art versus just merely consumptive. Or maybe that's the wrong word, but art, the purely passive consumption of art. And then deeper still, Bob, beyond, he articulated his motivation for wanting us to participate in his art. Bob wanted us to understand how therapeutic art could be. He taught philosophy at its core. Bob's encouragement for us to create art communicated the importance and significance of painting, especially landscape paintings, for him. He was a master of all of these layers. He was a harmony. He was unified as a person, as a whole. I think the most emblematic, the most respected, the most revered people are those that can be unified across all their domains of action in the world. Family, business, art, how they relate to other people in society, how they relate to people behind closed doors. It's always a bummer when we hear someone who we thought was great are really a jerk, really selfish, or even worse, have worse vices. Or even if they were just not as courageous as we thought they were. And it's not easy to be courageous, which is why we respect people when we feel that they are. The layers we respect about Bob is that he worked hard to become a master, but he also had an aptitude from a young age. So we found he, not only artistically, but personality, psychologically, he had an open personality that I think in this book showed allowed him to navigate between a disciplined military man during the day and in a position of authority and deep, great responsibility, and then at night put on that painter's hat, hang up the soldier hat, as he always said, and become that free-spirited artist, and create his own world, and be able to rejuvenate himself from the troubles of the day. And it's really cool reading this book because in light of all that's come out and all the biographical information about him, because they were spot on about so much of him, and learning more about his personal interactions and his just, childhood and other aspects of his life that these authors didn't have access to. It really just reinforces everything that they speculate about who Bob was as a person and what his motivations were. He was friendly, but he was stoic. He was deep with a light touch. I love that. He wasn't an intellectual, no, but he was perceptive and had wisdom to share, all the while remaining down to earth, which are all traits we all respect. He was a leader, a teacher, a mentor, a sage. He was a friend. He was an entrepreneur, and he was a radical, as we have talked about. I think at its core, I know, we're breaking down a lot of core components to Bob here. He remains influential to the world because he was authentic and promoted a universally understandable and inspiring ethic. It was cross-cultural. It broke language barriers. It broke historical trends. It was timeless, and it was universal. Universally revered. He believed in the divine spark of every individual. He didn't think just a couple people were born to be great artists. He saw and he paid attention to the individual. And not just people, he was a famous conservationist. He brought squirrels into his home and on his show. Raccoons, possums, snakes, alligators, hawks, owls, everything. He deeply believed this is where his authenticity is so captivating, because he was the same person on screen as he was off screen. That nature and animals can actually teach us if we just pay attention. Painting landscapes for him also served a deeper purpose. It was therapeutic and it was meaningful. They weren't just pretty scenes on a postcard. He always said, this is your world. Your world. You paint it how you want. And that's why for him, they were landscapes, pristine, no smog. Very seldom were any traces of human civilization or human activity of any sort, other than, the trails, maybe. The worn out, weathered trails. Only that which persevered and was most timeless found its way into Bob's paintings. He wanted to teach us that trying something new through learning art as just a single instance can lead to self-development. And then lastly, I want to say that he promoted the message of community. He always encouraged his viewers to not only call in and send in their paintings. He wanted them to paint and give them to practice and get good and be able to send a real gift. He said, painting is something that most people are always going to cherish as a gift. You know, it's so much more meaningful than something you can just go down to the corner store and buy. He said those are the gifts that friends and family cherish most and will for their whole lives. He always encouraged us to find our local animal shelter because he knew most of those people were paying out of their own pocket to care for animals, and they did it out of the good of their heart, as he often said. So he was respected because he respected nature, other people, and the potential in the individuals he was teaching. The rest of this video I have structured as a kind of a tour through. If part 2 was a chronology of Bob's life, this video is more of a chronology of human history in relation to Bob. It's quite a important place for Bob to hold, but I think his impact is going to reach far wider and deeper in time than most people are currently giving him credit for. And if this is a chronology of human history in relation to Bob and art and, well, everything that relates to art, which is quite a bit, it turns out, there's really nothing much deeper into our human history than learning. What marks us as humans is our ability to absorb information and our social nature. Many other animals are social, but we're very adept at absorbing the culture, the ways of being that other members of our social groups and species have lived out in learning what to do and what not to do. We do that through stories, but in order to be able to come up with a story and communicate it, you have to be an effective teacher. You have to be someone worth watching to begin with. And Bob had many of the qualities of an effective teacher to begin with. And that's why he was able to reach so many people. Towards the end of this video, we're going to be touching upon the revolutionary aspects of the internet and how that's changing the number and quality of the number of people and the quality of information that education in general is able to reach. And I'd say that Bob, and I make a case that Bob was a pretty key figure in the evolution of talking and teaching to a large number of people in the 20th century in particular. And we're going to call this education. We're not going to call it. It is called Education 2.0. It is a transformation in the way people receive information. And I think it's going to be a transformative effect on our society, liberating people from previous constraints. And we'll talk about what that means and what that is and what it means for the future. But first and foremost, Bob was an effective teacher. He was able to attract more interest in art to more people than any other teacher in history before him, using TV. On page 64, Congdon makes a case. Says, well, she mentions Bob being an effective teacher. And I hadn't realized this was actually a, well, like most of what's on Wikipedia, it's a whole field of inquiry and research and learning. She says, there's an extensive body of scholarly literature and education-related fields that examines the relationship between of a teacher's personality to the success and effectiveness in teaching. And this opened up a whole Wikipedia page for me. Enthusiastic teachers are particularly good at creating beneficial environments and relations with their students. There's a whole area of active research, of course, because it's important to not be ineffectively teaching. You know, you want to be efficient in the information you get across. And it's a waste of time and resources and human potential in life to just be teaching in a way that's not easily absorbable. The other outlines of what an effective, these fundamental attributes of effective teachers is that they must guide their students by aligning their personal goals with their academic goals. And this was going back to Bob teaching the whole individual, not just a narrow set of painting skills. Students who receive this positive influence show stronger self-confidence and greater personal and academic success. Teachers don't teach by rote, but ones that invite participation, use humor, create a sense of play with what they're teaching, all of which Bob was an exemplary figure of. Those are the teachers that engage their students most and encourage and are able to get curiosity about a subject matter out of them much more effectively. A correlation, there's a broad correlation between teacher enthusiasm and students' intrinsic motivations to learn and a sense of vitality in the classroom. And then there's the concept, this is all, I'm just casting a broad net here. I mean, that's really what this whole video is, actually. I like the word constellation. It's just like it's like a web of tightly and loosely related ideas. Some are central, some are on the periphery, but in a lot of ways they all connect with each other. And we're trying to understand Bob and what made him effective, what made him such a popular figure, what still makes him relevant and popular and so likable and endearing to so many people. How he's able to reach not only so many people lacking sleep, but people lacking creativity and, lacking companionship as well. And these are all aspects of effective teaching that don't need to be confined to the classroom. They, in a lot of ways, every interaction with anybody is a form of teaching or learning. It's an exchange. You don't talk about things that aren't worth mentioning. You mention things because they're worth knowing. And that all of these are very useful ideas in general for effective communication. The emotional contagion that I briefly mentioned there was pretty important, because people are also influenced by, just like we were saying, their environment and the enthusiasm of the teacher. Those tacit, those subtle body language related things that are picked up that don't even register on our consciousness at a conscious level. Those things are communicated that you really can't get over a Zoom call and even a video. But I think that having clear audio, very good audio, and secondarily good video are increasingly better substitutes for in-person communication, but they aren't ever going to be as effective. Because these things, like body language and tone of voice and subtle shifts in just the expression, the way you express yourself, are so important to rounding out and adding depth and impact to communication, that we're still learning about them. And this emotional contagion can be something that you don't even, again, consciously pick up, but you are nonetheless, as the word contagion implies, you're infected with the motivation. You're infected, you're interested. You might not even understand why, but you're somehow more engaged and interested and motivated to learn more about what is being taught. And Bob was a genius at this. He made you feel like you too were a conservationist, an environmentalist, like you were out there. You're in his mind. He painted a picture of his own worldview that went along so tightly and perfectly, harmoniously with the picture he was painting in front of us, literally. On page 64 and 5, again, they mention Bob's universal relatability. Like I touched upon, his viewership is translated across countries. Now it's on YouTube. It crossed, they argued that it permeated traditional class boundaries of art between, where was it? Let's see. Was it on this one? There we go. Bob resisted the conventional dichotomies of high and low, fine and folk, professional, amateur, and popular and classic art, pop and classical music, He was speaking to people, not to segments of society that people were a part of, in proximity to. He was able to reach those who are most underserved due to their geographic location or economic status. One National Geographic art director said that he actually got into his career because of Bob Ross. He said, to people like me who grew up in poor, rural areas and went to small schools and no museums, preschools, after-school education programs, no money to travel, couldn't pay tutors to instill in me a sense of wonder and expose me to social, cultural, refine my cultural palate and ideas and art. Bob Ross brought an immense value to my, he refined my cultural sensibilities. And not only that, but he, refined them through teaching art and technical and more philosophical ideas behind art, and in a relatable manner. And he was able to communicate that in layman's terms, essentially. And he said he went on to have such a successful and successful art-related career, in part because he spent endless hours watching Bob as a child. And then you scroll the YouTube comments. I got one here, for instance. Every single one of his 400 episodes on there are just littered with comments like this. Guy says, I wish I forgot what video this was from. He says, that bit there at the end, damn, he makes me feel like I'm the most important person in the world. Thank you, Bob. And then, this series is one of the best ever offered on public television. I really would have loved to see Bob do a guest spot on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And then, of course, this is a gift to the world. Another aspect of, he was accessible. He lowered the barrier to entry. So these are, he was effective because he allowed the teaching to begin in the first place. He, like we said in part 1, he drew you in with his looks, his wild appearance, his soft voice, his unique style, and sort of gimmicky, like Bill Alexander, ability to paint a very competent landscape painting in such a short period of time. Anyone doing anything of even the smallest measure of competence, quickly and efficiently, especially in that small of a time, is, going to draw attention. And then once we got in the door, that's where he continued to lower the barrier to entry and encourage us that we could do it. Look at me, and hey, by the way, you could do this too. No mistakes, happy accidents. Don't stress about any smudges or smears. The nature of the wet on wet technique he was using in and of itself was perfectly apt for this message, because it wasn't like a permanent marker. You could easily smudge it out and transform it and then pop another layer of a tree or water or something onto it. He gave, on 64 again, they say he gave permission to begin without fear of failing. And this avoids premature self-discouragement of learning in and of itself. He always says there's no right way of doing this, and that allows exploration, and it doesn't paralyze us with a sense of seeking perfectionism right away. I actually tried to relate this to my channel and what I'm doing, because my first video that got any form of mild success It's the one that has the Mass Effect thumbnail, Kardashev scale. I did at least 100 videos before that, and I never would have had the... I never would have been able to withstand the criticism of friends, people I knew, if I didn't have the ability, the low cost of putting up, just getting a simple microphone, a laptop, and my phone, putting the audio and video together and putting it out there, talking about things that I'm interested in, and seeing if people are also willing to watch it and maybe engage. But I never would have maybe taken the first steps to begin and made those terrible first videos. I still left I took most of them down just because I'm honestly not very proud of them or the work I put into making them. A lot of them I just was trying to see what worked and what people related to and what I was able to do and what I wasn't, trying to define my own boundaries. And technology allows us to it lowers the barrier like Bob did. It encouraged us to begin and try something new and make mistakes. That's okay. Next time you'll do better. And like he always said, don't expect this current creation, this current project to be a masterpiece. Your next one will be a masterpiece. There's still plenty to learn, because if you think you've made a masterpiece, there's no sense in learning more. And then, of course, you always risk losing that grounding humility if you think you've mastered anything. And that is a huge obstacle to learning and becoming a better person in general. On page 62, we could look at my YouTube poll a month or two ago I put up. I wanted to know whether you guys were most interested in my personality, the subjects, or the sound of my voice, like any specific aspect of what I convey. It was undoubtedly the subject matter, but some of it was, interestingly, there was overlap. My personality, and a lot of comments, a lot of the people who did comment made a point to say I would have chosen all of them. And with Bob, I get a strong sense of he brought a lot to the table. He wasn't good. He was a master of multiple areas. His communication, his painting, his style of communicating, his TV presence, his personality. Page 71, we see talking about qualities of Bob's effective teaching, in particular, his style. Page 71. They remark about Bob's sense of risk, sense of play. That is an engaging instructor, is one that doesn't stick to their notes and just read a PowerPoint presentation. I mean, who, unless they have a really good voice, you don't want to just sit there and why show up to class? And they say the sense of risk is at play in Bob's videos. Many people have noted that they hate it when Bob ruins a painting by putting a giant tree in the foreground, the front of the, covering up the mountains and everything he just beautifully created. So part of a viewer's engagement is not only seeing not only marveling at how Bob does it and how he makes it become much more than just a streak disrupting the beautiful painting he's already done. But it's to wonder if and when, maybe, he'll mess up. In those famously called Bob's Bravery test. And I noted here that two bands, and in particular artists, musicians and vocalists I really like is Brittany Howard and Jim James. Brittany Howard is the singer of Alabama Shakes, Jim James of My Morning Jacket. Both these singers have different voices, but they both, especially Jim James's early recordings, they both just belt it out, and they have such a, they're very far away from auto-tune and being digitally perfected, and I love hearing the nuances, and just like Etta James and Ella Fitzgerald and Aretha Franklin, Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, you hear in these raw recordings, you hear the talent, but you also hear the deviations from the melody, the slight tones that they only subtly miss, but the sheer, there's a sense of play and a sense of freedom and raw energy that is, in my opinion, sorely lacking in music that is overly manicured and curated and auto-tuned. You just don't have that sense of energy, really, of energy. It's missing a sense of energy. It feels like it's very much more restrained, it's just less interesting when it is. So, I just respect vocalists who really put themselves on the line, especially if it's in a live performance. And this is what Bob did. And he was very proud of it, like we talked about.
Now, I think it's time for your bravery test. Maybe in our world, let's use the old filbert brush. Maybe there's an old tree that lives out here. As I say, this is going to be your bravery test. Just drop it in. Drop it in. I know that's scary after you work so hard.
It was a live performance he was doing. It was taped and aired after the fact. But he always made a point to tell people that it was, when he was asked, of course, that it was live, and they didn't edit any mistakes out. And he really did that painting in 26 minutes and 47 seconds, whatever it was. And it's pretty impressive and he didn't do it. It wasn't just on accident. He did it by honing that. Steve, like I said in my last video, said that his dad painted at least 7 or 8 paintings for every one painting. He did it so that he would get the brush strokes, the layers, the individual pieces of the painting down, the trees and the streams and the reflection, the mountain, the clouds. He was able to streamline and get that time down, so he knew exactly how long every section would take. Pretty much every brush stroke. And then Annette Kowalski later said that he also would practice what he would say, which is why he didn't deviate too much when he did, but he went on occasional tangents. And that's when we get real glimpses into his personal philosophy. But he did often very often employ and reuse sayings and phrases that he'd said before, because he was doing many things at once there. We have to remember. And I think another important part was that Bob was always open to having different learning styles. And I think this, going back to his biography, was clear. It was very apparent in him at an early age. We saw that he didn't do well in school, and he talked about his teacher always marking up his papers with X's like he paints the clouds. And he always said how frustrated he'd get with paint teachers trying to be too abstract and esoteric and theoretical about how to paint, but not actually showing him and demonstrating how to actually literally paint a tree or something else. And this all constellated into who he chose to present himself as, which didn't diverge much from who he was as a person. It's how he was so authentic and so compelling. We said he made art relevant to us because a component of being an effective teacher is to focus on the whole person. You can't acknowledge that someone's tired and expect them to put forth 150% energy. You have to meet them at their level. And that's what Bob did. He constantly related learning specific skills with learning more generally. And he acknowledged that people learn differently and at different rates. And he didn't focus and compel you to fixate on any one in particular area if you didn't want to. It's your world, you know. You paint it how you want to. On 62, there was a behaviorist component to his teaching style. They noticed that he had a overlap with psychology and psychological movements. Bob demystified the process. He broke every task into a high-resolution subskill. And this is a famous behaviorist approach. The Pavlov dog experiment, he was a famous behaviorist. B.F. Skinner also. 62, they mentioned the schools and its ineffective general teaching, the ineffectiveness of general education, lower level elementary through high school education, because they have a one-size-fits-all approach. And Bob recognized that that's not the best means of reaching people and really getting people motivated in what you're doing. Yeah, they make a point to say that one important question to ask a teacher, and an art teacher in particular, is, and about Bob Ross's teaching style, is does the teacher want you to do what they're doing, or what you want to do? What you have an intrinsic motivation to paint? And they say Bob makes it clear that he wants his students to do what they want to do, and that working alongside him is, in a seemingly rote manner, it might assist you in getting there. It's going to teach you the basic skills to be able to eventually go off on your own. He provides a structure only, one that is also accepting and imaginative. This is your world, Bob continuously reminds us. And he continuously wanted students to shape their own worlds. The behaviorist component is, he would say, how to mix the paint, add thinner, how to apply it to the brush, what pressure, we mentioned this earlier. Say, light as an angel's wings, or just lightly, 2 hairs and some air, that's all, as you're lifting up on the clouds. So this inhibits doubt with constant, genuine affirmations. He was in tune with the audience's needs, gave constant verbal praise. This is another positive conditioning, constant affirmation, constant reaffirmation. Page 40, they compare him to Rogerian, Carl Rogers' method of positive regard and empathy. Say he responded with a kind of Rogerian empathy. His ability to transport himself and others into his world of joy may not seem like a sophisticated form of therapy, but it certainly echoes the language of healing that was developing in parallel with his show in the 80s, as the 70s and 80s, when he was honing his skill as a teacher. Bob Ross understood and appreciated the anxieties and emotions of his viewers at home. I think his early finger trauma, and all his other traumas, his cancer, which we said was not just late in life, that was a second bout that reoccurred in the 90s. He had, in his mid-30s, he had a fight with cancer, and he won it, and it he was able to overcome it, and it had gone away for a time. But even between then and his eventual death, he had constant headaches, migraines even, that people, or only a few people around he was knew about, because he hid it so well. And he had in the 80s, early 40s, he had a heart attack. He smoked cigarettes, apparently drank whiskey. So, these things, of course, didn't help, on top of a genetic predisposition, perhaps, because his father had died at 61 years old. His mother died at 63, in his early 60s. His mother had died at 71. And then he had his wife die. His split from his first wife, estrangement, his split from Bill Alexander, his mentor and friend, who I'm sure he was pretty, upset to have left like that. I think all of these add up to allow to make Bob a very empathetic and a compassionate, understanding person. He understood tragedy, as I pointed to in part 1. Rogerian client-centered psychology emerged in Ross's lifetime and caused a, quote, landmark shift in how psychologists heal their patients that are crucial to healing, to the healing and growth of both therapist and patient. You got to be genuine. You got to practice understanding and actual empathy. Not just superficial, but deep, true, putting yourself in the place of the client and responding with unconditional positive regard And this was very effective. Bob understood and appreciated the anxieties of his students. Oh, you'd be in Agony City by now. People might look at you a bit funny, but that's okay. Artists are allowed to be a little bit different. A little bit later in the book, they talk about Bob as therapist. Page 85 through page 88. Talking about sentimentality, they explain how Bob made a sandbox, which is a concept of just being able to play, giving a consequence-free environment, which of course facilitates learning, because you, as long as you're actively exploring and absorbing the information from mistakes, you don't have to deal with the penalties and the inhibitions of further creative exploration that come with those. And therapy in this same sense fostered healing, growth, individuation. Learning to create takes courage, because you risk failure. You expose your limits and insufficiencies to ridicule. It's taxing. It's draining to be able to put yourself out there like that. And for Bob, learning to paint, like I said, was analogous to learning per se. Learning in and of itself, the act of learning was cultivated through learning specific skills, and a lot of those skills can translate over into learning other things. Bob provided escapism. He was, they say his role was as a psychological ally. They say sentimentality was his employment of being overly sentimental and wholesome, as we might say nowadays, is a deliberate sanitation of life. He wasn't doing it on accident. He was doing it deliberately, because in his world, it's where he escaped, and he made it how he wanted, what felt most comfortable and relaxing to him. And that was within those boundaries of that picture plane. Bob Ross admitted no complexity. You had complete tranquility and complete freedom to explore. And in his shows, his presence, he implicitly omitted complexity by painting untouched, idealized nature. He explicitly omitted it by not talking about anything that's usually too stressful. He often said, if you want bad news, go, or if you want, go listen to the news if you want to hear bad stuff. He wasn't talking about health and bills and status, loneliness, conflict, politics. He was staying positive. And he understood that gratitude and empathy can be cultivated also by painting. He understood that, learning in and of itself could be a process that could be healing and cathartic and empowering. This one lady in particular, Arlene MacDonald, wrote an article called My Love Affair with Bob Ross. And I thought it was perfectly emblematic of how Bob connected to people. She said, "It happened suddenly one Saturday morning. I stumbled into my living room, a cup of coffee in my hands, trying to wake up. I turned on the television, and he helped me ease into the day, and there he was, standing before a blank canvas, with a palette knife in one hand and a 2-inch brush in the other. And he said, 'You'll never believe what you can do until you get in there and try it.' I was mesmerized," she said. "Before my eyes, in one short half hour, a beautiful mountain scene took shape. I thought to myself, I could do this. I could." The way he easily explained how to paint made me want to go out and get some oil paints myself. The next Saturday, I stood in front of my television, ready to start painting on my own blank canvas, and as a few weeks and months went by, it felt like Bob was talking directly to me. Exercise the imagination, experimenting with talents, being creative. This is Bob speaking here. These things to me are truly the windows to your soul. Truly the windows to your soul. Eventually I gained enough confidence to try a seascape. I suffered over that painting. I didn't know how difficult it was to paint ocean waves and really capture the glint of sunlight in the curl. But he assured me, the very fact that you're aware of suffering is enough reason to be overjoyed that you're alive and can experience it. In time, I missed our Saturday mornings together. I moved into my wise years. I tried my hand at other art forms, but what I learned from my love affair with Bob never went away. Bob, it's no doubt, Bob was an effective teacher. But to be receptive to teaching to begin with, you have to have the time. And this got me on a whole nother one of our tangents that I didn't realize there was an entire field about learning and researching. And that was leisure. And I never really thought about how important leisure is in relation to meaning and being able to do what you want to do. You know, it's just you work and then you don't work. And you do all the... Ideally, you can have the two be somewhat compatible and in the sense that they bring meaning to your life, but oftentimes that's not the case. And Bob wanted us to cultivate meaningful... He wanted us to pursue meaningful things in our leisure time. And I thought it was interesting. You know, I got my feet wet and I took a little bit of a relative deep dive into the history of leisure and what other societies throughout history and currently think about leisure and how they perceive it and its importance to the individual and the psychology and mental health and a health of society in general. And turns out Bob and what he was doing was greatly influenced by this general concept and the general evolution of how we perceive leisure and what it is and how it's changed, and who has changed it throughout history. Right in the beginning, Richard Florida, very interesting name. They say that he writes about social and economic theory, and he claims that, let's see, where is it? There's a way of, people are beginning to think about themselves and their identity differently nowadays, and this relates to leisure. It relates to what we most deeply identify with. Is it with our work? Is it leisure? Are the two related? Are they different? How has that relationship changed throughout history? And how is it currently transforming right now with the access? A huge part of it is new access to education. And, I recently renovated my house and used YouTube almost exclusively to learn plumbing, electrical maneuvering, how to fix things, how to work on things, all sorts of working on my car, changing my brakes, like simple, seemingly stuff like that. Drywalling, painting, everything, you name it. There is someone who's an expert, who's somewhat good at communicating their knowledge, and that is so valuable. And it's changing, it's transforming people, and it's allowing them to pursue new interests that because they never otherwise would have been exposed to it before the internet, that they are now realizing they had an inclination towards. Probably won't be able to find this. Well, he said there's a new wave of identity, one in which individuals define themselves both by the creative content of their lifestyle interests, as opposed to what they do for work. They are branching out, and this is changing the way they view themselves and viewing what they can do in their free time, and ultimately who they can become. Maybe they can transition careers entirely with enough dedicated pursuit of these part-time passions. I was reading this article, or this book I found in the library when I was working a few months ago, and I had never realized how modern of a concept the distinction between the separation between leisure and work really was. Because back in the day, in ancient times, there wasn't one. And it makes sense when you consider the increasingly smaller and smaller groups that we were a part of, our ancestors were a part of, the further back we go in history. There's a concept that in this textbook on leisure and modern society, I think I have it here. Yeah, recreation and leisure. This textbook here called Krauss's Recreation and Leisure in Modern Society, and chapter 3 is it's called The Early History of Recreation and Leisure. And I had no idea that this was an area of study. It's so interesting. We have a stand-up paddleboard here. It's their chosen image. I think this one, I got a... Obviously, I didn't want to pay full price for these price gouging textbook publishers. So I got a older edition, 10th edition, from... What year is this from? Probably 2010. Yeah. 2015. Alright. But, anyways. In a main concept is the integrity. I want to browse this chapter. I want to do a gloss of, and this whole chapter really is a gloss, but I'm going to do a gloss of a gloss. So hopefully it'll, yeah, something that's glossy has a lot of shine to it. I will say, hopefully it will shine some light on how we understand the importance of leisure in relation to us and, the individual and society, and how it affects, and how different societies in the past have looked upon leisure, and how they have, well, what's happened to them. I think the lesson I got for the TLDR was in the integrity of society relies upon the individual self developing themselves. And this is optimized by a spiritual connection with nature. Spirituality is important. I'm learning from people I've been recently learning about, Jordan Peterson being one of them, Mircea Eliade, Carl Jung. Spirituality isn't just a choice. I think whether it's, you call it religion, spirituality, or a personal, magic, a personal communion with God, having belief in something that lies beneath the facade of the observable, the immediately observable veneer of experience is what our ancestors through hundreds of thousands of years have based entire structures of society on. And it appears the more we learn about the anatomy of the brain and neurology and neuroscience, that our brain itself is built on structures that organize the way we perceive the world through a hierarchy of archetypes and archetypal virtues, ways of developing yourself, and very general roles that individuals can play in the process of history, and how societies and civilizations are shaped in the mythologies that they're based on, that they share, and that they choose to prune off, get rid of, discard, and continue in the other things that they continue to share throughout the generations. And communion with nature, a closeness, a respect and reverence for animals and nature, and a proximity to nature and exposure to nature, not cutting yourself off from the values like sacrificing your time now so that your harvests are more bountiful in the future, rather than just playing and while it's all rain or while it's all sunshine and warm weather, and failing to prepare and sacrifice for the winter and cold nights. And civilizations that prosper over time are those that were able to properly revere the seasons, the practices that allowed them to stay unified and not disintegrate from within, the structures of familial life, the strength that helped them develop the strength of the children and the men and women within society, so that everybody acts as a cohesive unit and cooperates and can rely and trust one another. It's not just a anarchic, everyone out for themselves philosophy or religion. I mean, there's so many interesting correlations between how individuals perceive the world, the stories we tell among individuals, and how societies rise and fall, and some endure and some collapse for good, some reemerge, and it's very important, I think, for us to recognize how this relates to our current society, how what we can glean from understanding the proper and improper ways, the mistakes and the successes of previous civilizations, so we don't have to repeat the mistakes, and so we can implement and properly respect what led to the successes of previous civilizations, and always, without fail, a reverence and a value of nature and what nature has to offer and what it has to continually show us, in a dependence, a relationship, a respectful, not parasitical, but I always forget the word, symbiotic relationship with nature in society is primary to what I've seen throughout this chapter here. Page 49. Since the Industrial Revolution, they point out, before going back in time, since the Industrial Revolution, technology has given us about 1,500 more hours per week. Per week. That's time travel right there. Per year. In the long run, industrialization, and this is about since around 1750, we can say, we went from having to work year-round with a lot of festivals and holidays, of course, but the day-to-day, we worked a lot more before the Industrial Revolution, and it's been up until about the last few decades, it has been an increasingly downward trend of hours worked per week and per year. So we've had more and more leisure time. Went from about 3,000 to ultimately about 2,000 hours on average from 1840. Sorry, so I thought it was 1750. It was 1840 to the present. So almost 200 years, we've reduced it by 1,500 hours per year. And this redistribution of time, this excess of time, has been accompanied by a drastic repackaging of leisure hours, making possible new forms of leisure time, including the typically modern notions of free evenings and the weekend, paid summer vacations, holidays, and this includes a lengthy childhood and, at the other end of life, retirement. Those are two very fascinatingly, I didn't realize how new these concepts were. Children, retirement is a very new concept. Most people just worked because they had to until they died. There was no retirement, and we have to, as a society, evolve our concept of what retirement is, because it's a self-defeating ideal to think of retirement as gluttony and just hedonism. You retire and you just, drink margaritas on the beach all day. Well, what if retirement was socially accepted as more of a freedom of constraints from having to work and do a job you don't truly want to do, and into a more realizing a more meaningful sector. And then lengthy childhood, of course, is because when you have to work as a family on a farm, or even early on, the general level of wealth was not nearly as high throughout all of history as it is now. And children had to go to work. Their parents simply couldn't afford to allow them to, get education and not work and have a lot of free time to pursue interests like they have in the last 50 years or so. By becoming familiar with the evolution and definition of what recreation and leisure is, we're better able to, this tells us more about what we value as humans, not just Americans or 21st century Americans, but humans in general. Just like Bob and his acceptance, his widespread love, tells us something about ourselves psychologically and why we like it, and why he was an effective teacher. What we choose to do for leisure activities and recreation, and what the accepted activities to do in society are, tell us a lot about what we value as civilizations and cultures and humans. Going back into tribal times, and then we have some modern day examples, of course, in the Amazon and whatnot that we can look at and observe. Scientists have done this. Tribal work, quote unquote work, is blurred between recreation and leisure time. It was somehow always usually creative and always personally and socially purposive. It was rarely trivial work or leisure, neither. It always was edifying. It was always with a purpose and meaningful and generally helpful for others in your group. Archaeologists of both ancient and modern tribal peoples have found that tribal people don't make the same sharp distinction that we do. And that was interesting for me. Because of course in the West in particular, but in modern industrial societies, we set aside our work and recreation times for different parts of the day. There is a sharp distinction there. But in these societies, these tribal societies, the work of any one individual tends to be varied and creative. They don't do the same monotonous thing, the typical example of just the generic example of putting, buttons, the same buttons in the same place of a shirt in a factory 12 hours a day. They're the exact opposite of that. Instead of a narrow, specifically, defined, specialized task, their work was intimately connected to group success. And importantly here, this is going to be a very brief but important connection to work and leisure and just general activities and spirituality and rituals. Work for them was often accompanied by some sort of ritual. Whether it was prayer, sacrifice, dance, feasting. And these rituals were regarded as crucial to their success of whatever endeavor they were doing. Whether it was, planting a harvest, building dwellings, venturing on a hunting expedition, all of which could end up in death or destruction in some way. So this allows the very ritual, the very enacting of the ritual. It's not just saying words, it's often doing and acting out things, and that allows an incorporation of the individual who's acting it out of their own creative capacity to be called forth. So this made it more fun and more exciting. This isn't just in church, for those Christians or who grew up as Christians, reciting very monotonously hymns or very overly formulaic chants or prayers. This requires, although it's bounded within tradition, and there's rules and there is clear guidelines and structure to all these rituals, an important part of that is that it requires movement and awareness and a deep spiritual connection and the activity to be meaningful to you. Popular games, for instance, were often vestiges of warfare, practiced as a form of sport. So you can imagine honing your skills during times of peace was very important, and games were a great way to use competition as a way to maintain a competitive athleticism and advanced skills, so whether it's shooting or running, endurance. Musical instruments were likely created for use in religious rituals to begin with, so they added a musical element to the ritual, giving it more depth and meaning and resonance. And then this, of course, as skills and songs were developed and players and practitioners increased in number, it expanded out further into other areas of society. And in other forms of art, in the more narrow defined sense, like pottery, painting, drawings, these most likely evolved out of something much more basic to our human needs and interests, our daily life and the mythology that accompanies our constant activities and the planning of activities and how we relate to one another, always acting out the ritual of the successful hunter, the god or the goddess that was the most keen hunter and keen-sighted, and the most intellectual, the wisest god to help tribes decide how and where to plant the next harvest and build their village, and maybe what if they're nomadic, what ridge to go over, what direction to go, what to pursue as a culture. It's so interesting to know that, everything, daily life was infused with a sense of meaning, and everything you did was purposive. It meant something, and the lack of doing something also meant something too. You weren't carrying your own weight, and if you were doing it from a point of view of selfishness, that quickly probably got you ostracized, and therefore was probably not too prevalent. But you don't need much more meaning in a close-knit society, and as I'll elaborate on later, than the relationship between your brothers and sisters and family and cousins and neighbors and those in-group members of your tribe, the well-being of them and the success, and then in times of war, the survival. That is enough motivation for anybody to feel like every day you wake up with purpose and deep, deep, deep meaning and connection to not only your immediate family members, but your ancestors and the mythological landscape out of which you and them arose. And of course, that's intimately connected with the environment and the landscape, the actual landscape, in nature more broadly, in the way we look at it today. All of this is it's so interesting to me that this is it's just taken for granted. It's just a part. If you would have pulled, even if you could get them to speak English, pulled someone out from 10,000 years ago, out of a tribal setting, they wouldn't even think anything of viewing their life purpose and goal as obvious, whereas we question it at every turn in modern society. And a lot of that has to do, as I'll make the as I'll make the point, is our lack of connection to each other nowadays. And therefore we don't have a story, we don't have a mythology, we don't have an orientation toward a future that we're all striving together towards. A lot of us don't, and a lot of people don't. Some do, and those that did in the past thrived and survived. As Mircea Eliade, as he very impressively illuminates through his study of history and religion, those that didn't in the past have purpose and cooperation and a sense of cohesiveness within their society, they perished more frequently, more often. They, through a sense of, I would say, being overwhelmed by the suffering and tragedy that is innate in existence. Those that, on the other side, on the other hand, were connected and whose destiny and fates were intimately intertwined with those of their own group, and who had these archetypal qualities of reverence towards things that endure and a respect for wisdom. Those were the groups who, I heard one, they endured. I heard one interesting, I follow Dr. Michael Sugru on YouTube, and he's been posting one of his fellow colleagues' lectures, Darren Stalhoff, I think. Anyways, he was lecturing about Mircea Eliade and said that a great example was a rain dance that we obviously recognize today, and we know scientifically will not affect the rainfall. But the very pragmatic, the very understandable purpose, what it did for the people who enacted it in the past was a sense of belief and a sense of control over their environment. And maybe if only pragmatically and only internally, they felt less vulnerable to the whims and chaos of nature, that whose, of course, physical, chemical underpinnings they didn't understand back then. That could be very daunting and therefore discouraging, and therefore perhaps cause you to give up sooner than is required in order to survive. So those people who enacted that could have devastating consequences for entire societies, as you could imagine. So those who not only worked together, but also had the same belief, the same gods, the same spiritual orientation, the same rituals that they all believed in, that they all acted out together. This emotional contagion we talked about, it's important. This allowed people to remain optimistic and endure and put forth more effort than the other neighbors next door, the less cohesive, spiritually and physically, socially cohesive people next door. When you're unified, you're inspired, you're encouraged to run that extra mile, chase that antelope. When you feel that the gods and the winds at your back, and you are a reincarnation of a past ancestor who was the expert at hunting. When you feel connected to your group and the history of your group and the ancestors and the environment in which your group emerged, you are much more, psychologically at least, than otherwise you might be. So interesting. So next they talk about how this has subtly shifted throughout pre-ancient almost, if we're as we transition through the ancient world and into medieval Renaissance, and then eventually into more modern industrial and contemporary times. Wealth, the leisure and work slowly started to diverge. Generally, with the increase in wealth, there is an increase in free time, increase in the origins of leisure are essentially the free time to which the group's survival was not linked. So the more free time you have, the more time you have to do activities that aren't a part of rituals and necessary group dynamics, the more you're going to have skill specialization, class division, and ultimately you're going to have maybe more technology advancing and perhaps finer arts, sophistications of artistic and physical pursuits, and religious and more nuanced religious ideations. But you're also going to have sharp divisions between people and the jobs, and those people who fall into those increasingly subdivided categories of society. As prehistoric societies advanced from nomadic hunting and gathering into permanent villages and cities, and eventually they developed these specialized functions. Ultimately, we had a class distinction developed between ruling and the lower classes, those that rule and own land, and the increasingly less free classes, from soldiers to craftsmen to peasants and slaves, developed. In the aristocracy of the first civilizations that developed in the Middle East, Mesopotamia, during the first 5,000 years before the Christian era, we find ourselves in the first time with a leisure class for the first time. Now, as we move forward a couple thousand years into ancient Greece and then eventually Rome, we'll get to Rome in a second, but Greece was its precursor. They based a lot of their values and society, social structures and beliefs even off of Greece and ancient Greece. In Greece, leisure was far from what we look at it today as just being able to veg out on the couch. Or even, do something more productive like go hike. It sort of overlaps with that more, but it was far, far from any sort of vice, any sort of gluttony, idle, hedonism. The word Areté in ancient Greece is what defined leisure activities. Now, to be sure, this was only confined to the aristocracy. There was still slavery, still lower class peasants, essentially, very, very, even lower class businesses that didn't have the leisure time of the aristocracy, but it was almost as a rule an integral part of the social fabric. It was what was expected of you, just like most of the aristocracy of today is expected to at least go to college. Back then, the energies were directed at higher, more abstract pursuits. They had Areté was the ideal of the balanced man. And of course, this was applied to women a little bit, but mostly men. This balanced man was a combined soldier, an athlete. He was an artist, though. And he was also a statesman, an artist of social and psychology. And on the deepest level, he was a philosopher. This is where we got Plato, his mentor Socrates, and Plato's student Aristotle, out of this class of individuals. So you had to be not only a thinker of abstract ideas, you had to be a pragmatic, you had to be effective. Athenian leisure wasn't loafing, anything but that. See, in deep Homeric history, even further back, maybe if we think about Periclean Athens is 600 BC, 1,000 years before, maybe 500 years before, something like that, around 1000 BC or within a couple hundred years, we had the more Homeric, less intact historical evidence remains from this period. So it's more mythic, more surrounded in the haze of mythology. But this, from this era, is the first little inklings of where we get, actual words and meanings of words from, for the ancient Greeks. In this history where we have the Iliad and the Odyssey, where they come from, the person of Areté is of the highest effectiveness. No matter what they do, if it isn't effective in the real world and able to act out, it's useless. It doesn't, you can make it as abstract as you want, as long as it can be enacted in a harmonious way with action in reality. They use all their faculties. They don't have an imbalanced self-development. They have strength, they have bravery, they have wit. Odysseus is emblematic of Areté. The moral and religious duty to Areté predates the philosophical reflection of even the earliest pre-Socratic philosophers. The literary source of these values is, of course, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, most primarily. And in these, the people who were most excellent, Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, they were emblematic of Areté, which meant they were emblematic of excellence of any kind. They had moral virtue, which means excellence in knowing and doing what is good. The fulfillment of a purpose or function, the act of living up to one's full potential, not leaving anything on the table. The aristocratic class was presumed essentially by definition to be exemplary of Areté. The root of the word, interestingly, is the same as aristos, the word which shows superlative ability and superiority. So they have the same root word. Aristocracy, Areté. The objective of a successful life to them in ancient Greece was attaining time, or honor, and hybris, trying to go beyond one's possibilities. So there's a sense of becoming greater than you were, constantly at work, at play here. From earliest childhood, interestingly, in ancient Greece, this wasn't just an adulthood thing you got that was expected of you. This was cultivated. This was, again, like the earlier societies. It was integral to existence. It was in the fabric of being a member in the aristocratic class, though, in those societies. From earliest childhood, Athenian citizens engaged in varied and intense athletic activities like wrestling or dance, and even music and drama. Athenian philosophers, Plato foremost among them, felt that play activity was essential to healthy physical and social growth of children. So they believed strongly in the unity of mind and body, and how you moved and how you acted and how you thought and viewed the world. And how this permeated and related to all forms of human activities, qualities, excellence, morals, values, characteristics. And so, as an adult, this, again, isn't an isolated set lifestyle. This was a very integral social event, and that meant you participated in social activities and events, such as in which you employed all these skills. So you wrestled, you orated, you debated, you sang, you danced, you wrote plays, you played instruments, you philosophized. The Olympic Games, you participated. The ancient Greeks developed the art of town planning, customarily made extensive provisions for parks and gardens, open-air theaters and gymnasiums, and baths and exercise grounds and stadiums. And during the time of Plato in the 350s BC, the parks were closely connected. Importantly here, this was the most revered, this is the golden age of Athens, of Greece. The parks were closely connected with beautiful natural settings. Now a gradual transition occurred after this, from Greek to post-Golden Age Greece, and then eventually to Rome. As Greece waned, Rome came out of its birth and adolescence and matured, and the power over the Mediterranean was subsumed by Rome. Greece became just a satellite nation to the core, to the powerful strength in Rome, centered and guided from Rome. The gradual transition that occurred was that these initially public, mostly public, baths and even some parks gradually gave way to privately owned estates of land, large chunks of land, and then the religious and cultural functions of the Olympic Games and other festivals were weakened by athletic specialization, corruption, and commercialization following that, as essentially the Areté was corrupted. It got imbalanced. People decided to maybe focus more on weightlifting and endurance than philosophizing and statesmanship. And they weren't able to have that harmony of skills and excellence in all domains of life. And this, the authors of this book here argue, was crucial to disintegration of a strength, essentially, of unity, of the ability to endure as a civilization. Rome took them over, but Rome, even in its heyday, in its golden age, was the Caesar, Christ, year zero, around there. Primarily less artistic, less Areté, less harmonious, and less philosophically beautiful, and more pragmatically grand and magnificent. They focused more on war and building magnificent structures, large, grand colosseums, temples, what the citizen could become to serve the state, how good of a soldier or statesman they were, not necessarily how good of an artist, musician, playwright, philosopher they were. That's why ancient Greece has many more beautiful plays and works of philosophy than ancient Rome did. They say at first all citizens were expected to participate in ancient Greece in the Olympic Games, but then the Olympic Games were restricted more and more, first to freeborn Greeks only, and then in time it got specialized, and all the drama, the arts, those two were restricted and performed only by highly skilled specialists, usually drawn from the lower class or even the slaves sometimes, but they were trained and perfected, and they were more and more, it became a more commercial enterprise to be hired and put on shows for private events rather than be a public spectacle that all could enjoy and participate in. Interestingly, I'm going to circle that back around to Bob and how he wasn't just trying to be a spectacle to be passively consumed. Bob wanted us to participate as well. He wanted us to enter into the games, not just be using him as a spectacle, but using him as a vessel to inspire us and give us a vision of what we too could become. This state excellence over Areté that I was alluding to didn't end good for the Romans. Their empire too collapsed, and leisure and business were two words in Latin that sounded similar, but the distinction in the meaning of them was it helps us understand. It was illuminating. So leisure was otium, and business was negotium, like as in negotiating, suggesting that if free time was otium, leisure, otium, free time, then the opposite or negation of otium was business and work. So this tells you something about Romans and their society. Roman leisure connoted a more utilitarian sense of duty to the state than a abstract spiritual self-development. To Romans, games and play meant physical fitness for the purpose of being a good soldier. They didn't emphasize the aesthetic or spiritual artistic play of dance or theater or philosophy. And as the empire grew more powerful, the necessity for military service, of course, and other physical efforts, it declined for the Roman citizen because they got more and more as they took over vaster areas of lands and tribes on the fringes. That's where they drew their conscripts from. And so the actual citizens, or the low-level plebeians, they didn't have to be fighting anymore. They didn't have to maintain any sort of Areté. They had more otium, less negotium. Most of the work even was done by the coloni, or the slaves, the class right above the slaves, brought to Rome. And there's a huge urban population eventually of plebeians lived essentially in semi-idleness, because leisure increased as entertainment became the central life activity, as the sense of self-development declined, and the sense of hedonism increased. Yeah, so there was bored masses of plebs. The emperors and eventually the senates eventually wanted to just quell any dissent, and any, not dissent, well, dissent, but just any sense of any dissatisfaction, any discontent, I guess is the word I was looking for, by just putting on all these games, giving them stupid entertainment that wouldn't help develop them. Pure passive consumption. And it was evil entertainment. From a modern Christian point of view, it would be evil. It was watching people get mutilated in the Colosseum and the gladiatorial games and combats, and sometimes just outright murdered and tortured. And this was mass debauchery. It was corruption behind every corner, and a perversion that profoundly weakened the Roman state. Eventually, the empire lasted about 1,000 years, from 500 BCE to 500 CE, or AD. And then 500 AD, it fully collapsed. 476 is the famous date that it collapsed. When, was it Alaric? One of the early German kings and rulers that was already a part of the Roman, he broke off and turned against Rome from being a Roman soldier and a commander of the Roman armies, and took over Rome and the empire in the west. It was broke off in the Eastern Empire, Istanbul, Constantinople, your Turkey. That empire stayed relatively unified and intact, although not still just a shadow of its former grandeur, until about 1500 AD, the Renaissance. But 500 in the west, anything west of Greece, really, fell into the Dark Ages for about 1,000 years, where the social structure that Rome had given Europe collapsed into these small local fiefdoms, where local kings just had owned all the land and controlled local populations of essentially slaves, peasants. And that became the Middle Ages, where there was just small little battles, and there were no massive, large-scale empires, not even really countries. There were people who vaguely spoke the same language, but there was no, along with this large-scale social structure and unified cultural and religious practices that Rome gave, there was no unifying law among these little fiefdoms, and there was a lot of continued corruption, continued lack of safety. There was not very much travel on the roads. There wasn't very much commerce in between kingdoms. And as a reaction to what they felt had led to the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, the Christian Catholic Church, emerged out of this collapse. The collapse of empire through the collapse of values, what they thought, and what appears to have been the truth. And the Catholic Church, having suffered historically under the brutal persecutions of Christians by the Romans, the early Christians condemned all that these pagan oppressors, the Romans, had stood for, especially their hedonistic way of life. Morals became the center of the budding adolescent European culture out of which modern Europe would arise. This is when, at this point, Christian values really take root and begin defining and being interwoven with society and culture, and as nations, Spain and France and sort of the German nation, what would much later become the German nation, in England, in Italy, slowly began unifying and rising in wealth as more and more, as the unification, as the church, the Catholic Church, unified the values and therefore the actions and behaviors of societies in early Europe. They, like idleness is the great enemy of the soul. Therefore monks should always be occupied either in manual labor or reading. They even believed in fanatical asceticism. A lot of the early saints and fathers of the church were known to have been ascetics, which means basically means self-discipline, a lot of times through self-deprivation, fasting, or even masochism, self-flagellation, beating and hurting yourself to keep your emotions and urges at bay, in check, your animal instincts subdued. And you can imagine, as happened, the general individual was much less inclined to be corrupt. They were more honest. They had Christian values. And this was an improvement overall on the less morally intact Roman citizen. Less selfless, less devoted to a higher plane of existence than the early Christian, I guess the average European, although there were still peasants, a lot of debauchery, a lot of less than moral behavior among the peasantry. The aristocracy was overall in Europe marked by chivalry, the emergence of knighthood, and the medieval culture of royal courts, in which all those those values took root. As those emerged, those in general were more elevated morally than the typical Roman aristocracy, senator, or politician. The medieval nobility ultimately led around 1300, 1400 to a renaissance, a rediscovery of Areté. This is when a lot of the texts, a lot of why do I always pronounce texts like that? The Islamic Arabic scholars during this 1,000-year period after the collapse of the Roman Empire had actually, their culture had been thriving, and they had taken and translated a lot of the texts of the old Greeks and Roman thinkers and writers. And Europe had lost a lot of the literacy. The average person was not literate for a long time because they had no institutions, they had no stability in commerce. All these little fiefdoms were always warring with each other. We come to see that if you lack spiritual cohesiveness and unity, your society takes the brunt of that and it disintegrates. The average person is selfish, therefore you can't trust them, therefore there's a lot of corruption, therefore the flow of money accumulates in the hands of the few greedy, corrupt people. Infrastructure declines, standard of living lowers, the general prosperity of the average person goes down, and it's a downward spiral. You're much more susceptible to attack from more unified, cohesive, spiritually unified and cooperative and oriented nations and peoples. And you crumble within and without. The Renaissance reintroduced the noble values of the Greeks to European culture. European nations eventually, Italy, France, Spain, England, etc., they eventually stabilized. And this led from a power shift from the Catholic Church, which had a monopoly on the kings were beholden to the Pope throughout all these years. The Pope has existed since the first few hundred years after Christ died, and the general belief and the general belief in Christianity of all the European kings and their noble courts gave a unity to Europe. It gave a unified set of values and a way to interact. And as the general nation and the peasantry were lifted out of absolute poverty by the time 1,000 years had passed and 1400-ish had come about, the average person was more educated and more literate. Lutheranism broke off from Catholicism, saying that now that a lot of people can read, we don't want to listen to you tell us what the Bible means. We want to read it for ourselves. We can find our own faith in the text, not through your interpretation of it. But generally, so the power left the church. Became increasingly, for the last 500 years, the trend has continued to become more and more secular. We think that despite the stabilizing effect that the unity of values from Christianity and at its core, Catholicism, had given Europe, we think we no longer need it, even though that's how we got as initially unified as we are and were. But nonetheless, less war, more commerce, more travel between the European states led to a greater exchange of information, technical progress, early science in 1300 through 1500, and this led to more wealth. And we, with all this new exchange of information, we became increasingly more infatuated with this sense of Areté and what leisure meant for the average person. The famous French essayist and philosopher Michel de Montaigne discussed the education of children, saying that our very exercises and recreations, running, wrestling, music, dance, hunting, riding, fencing, will prove to be a good part of our study. It's not a soul, it's not a body that we are training, it is a man. It is the individual, the whole person. We ought not to divide him into two parts. John Locke, famous English philosopher, said recreation for older youth and adults is not being idle, but easing the wearied part by change of business. So, as we got this general trend over the next couple hundred years in Europe, there was a famous guy, Horace Greeley, a leading American journalist in 1876, observed that although there were teachers for every art, science, in elegy. There was no professor of play, of activities to do with our free time. And the general zeitgeist started becoming a concerned with this. In 1880, not too long after, U.S. President James Garfield declared in a speech at Lake Chautauqua, we may divide the whole struggle of the human race into 2 chapters. The first is the fight to get leisure, and the second is what to do with it once we have it. I thought it was an interesting little historical trivia that New York's Central Park, initially it took a reform to come about because it never existed. For a long time, there was some vague plans, and the 843-acre park that exists today only came about through a serious social effort of people making their voices heard, and it was only in like scattered bits of land and plots that totaled to about 400 acres. And then by the 1850s, the entire amount of public space of Manhattan had only open public space, had only made up about less than 120 acres. And so there was a pressure that built up in these movements, communicating that there was a need for the citizenry, especially with the rapidly accelerating construction and removal of trees and landscaping from the New York environment, for a relief from all this stone and concrete. The poet William Bryant said that commerce is devouring inch by inch the coast of the island of New York, and if we would rescue any part of it for the health and recreation, it must be done now. And finally, in 1856, not too long after, the 43-acre site that we know of today finally began. And apparently every single foot of the park's surface was man-made. Every tree, bush, every arch, every roadway, it was made and designed with a purpose. And it was importantly, the philosophy behind it was a refreshment of the mind and nerves for city dwellers through the provision of greenery and scenic vistas. This is going to be an important part to Bob Ross's landscapes. The park was to be heavily wooded and have the appearance of untouched rural scenery, with roadways, or only lightly touched. With roadways, the traffic, the buildings, screened from the eyes of the park users wherever possible. Wherever possible. This is just a useful point of the, again, general zeitgeist as the Industrial Revolution really got full steam ahead, so to speak, in the 1850s. That's right when the park, the demand for nature, essentially, was heard and felt and heard. 70 years later, in the Depression helped to stimulate national concern about problems of leisure and recreational opportunity. There was a number of studies revealed a serious lack of structured recreation programs for young people, and especially minority people There was a report around that same time that said the leisure of the American people constitutes a central and crucial problem of society. Now we're going to see we've had more within the last 150 years since then, or the last 100 years since this Depression era realization and continued focus on leisure. We've had more leisure to ourselves. We've had more free time. We've had a rise in wealth. We've had a growing distance among members of communities as populations increase. We've had less religious unification. People are becoming more and more secular. They're losing connection with their local cities and towns and villages and neighborhoods. We have things that are increasingly making us de-unified, there's a disunification. We are becoming more isolated, with a diminished sense of community, really. And we're going to see that Bob relates all these historical movements, and there's a whole there's one in particular, the Hudson River School of Landscape Painters, founded by Thomas Cole, who was himself very, very aware of the potential vulnerability of America in the 1800s to the same fate that the Roman Empire had. If we didn't appreciate higher values of Areté, appreciate a connection with nature, cultivate a spirituality, even if it wasn't Christianity per se. If we didn't pay attention to the self-development of the individuals within a society might be at risk of collapsing. And he was a famous landscape painter.